Thank you. Hello, Sphere. Yeah. Thanks for coming to this talk after all that food. Um, Personally, I would like to be eating more, but here we are. So, yeah, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Justin. I work at JetBrains, as you heard, as the team lead for the Bazel team. So, to get a feel of my audience who actually knows what Bazel is, okay, it's a good bunch. It's better than at the last conference I went to, a Java conference. Um, who actually uses Bazel? Okay, that's a few. For those who don't, I'll give a very short introduction later. Anyway, about me. So I worked at JetBrains mostly on the Scala plugin for IntelliJ for about 6 years or so. And within that context, mostly on build tool integration, namely SPT and BSP, so the build server protocol to integrate more build tools with a single protocol to rule them all. Yeah. And thinking back about what kind of projects I was most familiar with, mostly dealing with there in SPT, Maven, Gradle, and so on. So these projects have like a few dozen modules, are fairly small, so sometimes they're just a few megabytes, usually not more than a gigabyte of code and stuff. And if you open them in your IDE and import them and refresh them, they'll be like, it'll take a few seconds or maybe minutes if you're not lucky. Maybe in some cases more. Anyway, life was good, kind of. But yeah, projects and complexity of organizations are growing. So again, audience question, I'd like to get a feel of like where we're at, like what kind of projects do you use? Are you working on fly-sized projects, so like a few megabytes maybe? Not, okay, nobody. Yeah, human-sized, a few 100 megabytes. Okay. King Kong-sized, gigabytes. Okay. Yeah, we're all over the place, except nobody does a megabyte project, megabyte of code anymore. I don't know. Cool. Yeah. So about my tragic backstory again. Yeah. Over the pandemic, I got into a bit of a rut with Scala and SPT stuff, so I thought we'll do something new in the company. Customer success engineering. In practice, that means mostly we talk to a lot of customers, big customers, and listen to their problems and say, yes, I feel you, man. But we also try to extract some patterns there as to what kind of problems. And one of those that stuck out was, yeah, many are going to King Kong projects, throwing all their code into a monorepo, and they want to build that with a common build tool, and often that ends up being Bazel, or usually that ends up being Bazel these days. So, and they found Bazel support is maybe not as good as they'd like in IntelliJ, so it's kind of hard to work with it through the IDE rather than through the command line. So we made a Bazel team, and somehow I became team lead. Yeah, so if you don't know about Bazel, it tries to solve the problems in monorepos that you often have in big monorepos, where you don't want to rebuild the whole repository every time you push a commit. Rather, you'd like an incremental change to only cause an incremental build. So it tries to make that faster and more correct, is what it claims. Yeah. So we already got a short intro to monorepos. What's the whole point of them? Like one of the big promises is to ascend from dependency hell. So instead of publishing artifacts and then consuming them from another artifact, and having these cascading version upgrades. If you have like chains of dependencies between artifacts, you just have one big code base, you depend on the code directly, and you have one version for all the code, so no version conflicts there, ideally, yeah. So great, some of your problems are now solved, and you get all new problems. So yeah, the IDE tooling was built mostly not with monorepos and Bazel in mind, but with classical repos that aren't King Kong sized. So there's no really good established tooling paradigm for that. Stuff kind of works, but it feels a bit like a hack. So gonna compare some of the problems, some of the assumptions with the monorepo reality. So here we have the classical project, and here the complex monorepo project in abstract art, generated by AI, of course. So in a classical project, typically we'll have a limited project scope. So you import the project as a whole into your IDE. You work with that. You have a few modules. There might be fairly chunky, so there have a whole bunch of code that gets compiled together. Most of your dependencies are probably like binary artifacts that you consume from some, I don't know, artifactory, for instance, or directly from Maven Central. And the structure of the project is generally static, so you can describe it in a file. Whereas with monorepos, you might want to import the whole repo. It'll take a while, but some people do that and then work on a state of the given repository. But many would prefer to check out like some subdirectories, maybe an arbitrary set of subdirectories that they just happen to be working on right now, and work with those. Instead of a few modules, typically in Bazel you define many targets, it's called in Bazel. So usually like one per package, and dependencies between them, and you'll have thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of these small fine-grained targets, whereas the IDE isn't really built with thousands or tens of thousands of targets in your thing in mind. Yeah, and the project structure might be computed, so you might not know the full project structure before you run a compile of parts of it. Oh yeah, and you can have source dependencies besides binary dependencies, so you depend on parts of the source directly. That can cause problems if you share the same dependency from different parts of your code. Now, problems that result from all of this. So with bigger repos and more complex build structures, you have more metadata, and that'll cause more memory overhead in the IDE. You have frequently changing code, so if you work on larger parts of it, there will constantly be changes. You might want to update those changes on your local working copy, and then that will cause re-indexing. So you might be familiar with indexing in IntelliJ and how it blocks certain actions. So you get even more of that, yay. I mentioned the shared sources, so the IDE kind of assumes, well, IntelliJ at least kind of assumes that you have only one module per source file. Now, so it will be only compiled within one context. Often in Bazel repositories, you might want to compile the same target, the same source within the context of several targets. For instance, when you cross-compile to several different platforms or several versions of a library. We also have this problem in SBT and Gradle, but maybe to a lesser extent. When you want to do repository-wide actions such as refactoring, completions, finding usages, so that can become troublesome if you do it over the scope of a whole large repository, if you want to load it into your IDE at once. Again, the memory overhead, right? And if you have such a large code base, the navigation might become a bit of a UX issue. So you might have many conflicting or very similar names, thousands of directories, target module names that are very similar and do slightly different things. So everything becomes a bit unwieldy. And finally, but not least, the configuration of such a monorepo is often very complex. So even with our relatively small repository that I worked on, the Scala plugin, there was usually one person working just on improving the build configuration in one way or another, or the artifact publishing, or some part of just getting the project to work. And with a organization spanning repository, that just gets dialed up further. And the common business logic developer might not want to deal with all that and might not know how to. So honestly, yeah, I'm a bit overwhelmed by all these problems, like how to prioritize them, how to address them. So I just go, to my workmates, my company mates, my teammates. We talk about what to do about performance, and well, it turns out a lot of this is old school optimization work, and we are working on that as a company a lot currently. So expect performance improvements in your IDE, but I can't tell you about details there right now. I go to the customers. I ask them, hey, how do you deal with your Giga projects? And they say things like, okay, we might import only parts of the whole monorepo, like a working subset, so to reduce the working scope. Like, sure. They might import limited dependency depth. So usually if you import a project and its dependencies, you'll get all the transitive and dependencies, so like a huge set of dependencies. And in practice, you probably don't need to navigate to all the symbols of your dependencies. So you can just, import a limited subset into the IDE while the build tool still knows about them, so everything can be compiled and tested and run normally. And another idea is to import only import and index only the interfaces themselves, so not even the binary dependencies. Another approach here is moving work to the server. So indexes again. Yeah, you are typically waiting for a long time if you have a large project for the indexes to generate. So why don't you pre-generate them on a server? Like, you can do this on the CI server, and for Bazel specifically, we're actually working on Bazel rules that can generate these indexes for your project and dump them right into the Bazel cache, and you can consume them from a remote Bazel cache locally. This does have a downside, so actually generating indexes is fairly fast, even if you won't believe it, because if you want to download these indexes, you actually need a fairly high bandwidth connection to download them faster than you would generate them locally. The next approach is to actually pre-warm the whole working environment. So you would have a IDE backend that imports your project, generates the indexes, has everything ready for you on a server, and you just connect to that through remote development. This is something that IntelliJ supports since fairly recently. So, and it's nearing the market readiness, I would say. Yeah. And finally, we talk about this in the team a lot, and well, we come up with some vague ideas that we're not quite ready to work on yet. That includes like maybe lazy project loading, so that you could, you could load parts of the project as you work on them. So if you navigate to one part, one file, then it would tell you, okay, this part of the project is not loaded, and you can just load the local dependencies and modules. Maybe another idea is server-side code actions, so you could have a server that doesn't run a full IDE, but allows you to do refactorings across your code base, whereas you work locally. Yeah, so I think, time's up. So this is the Sphere over Krakow. This is you. So if you have any questions, comments, then please, I'm right here.
I think we have time for 2 questions, so feel free to ask them.
Anyone? Raise your hands.
Okay.
Are you seeing, there's no question, I may ask one. Are you seeing, given in your line of work, working on the IDE, you have a lot of interactions, I guess, with customers and their code bases, you see how it looks like. Do you see that the monorepos are becoming more and more popular, even outside of typical, usual suspects like, big companies like Meta or, or Twitter?
Like the majority of large customers that we talk to are interested or already moving to monorepos, yes. With smaller users, very many don't even know why you would do it. So I'm seeing a large divide here, yeah.
Okay, I see one more question. Okay, two.
Okay, so you mentioned that you are working on Bazel, and it was like just an example, as I understand, for the build system for the Monorepos project, like the most common one. Mm-hmm. But how about other build system, like maybe Gradle or I think about 2 aspects of this question. So one is like, what are the other options, or like what are the recommendations, and the second aspect is how about the support in JetBrains tools.
So what are the other options for like building monorepos?
Yes, like build systems, like because basically it's probably the default choice, but there is a lot of, let's say, bad opinions about this tool. There are people who really hate it. And what are the alternatives?
Well, there's a bunch of Bazel-inspired alternatives, such as Buck and Pants and Please, I think. Many large repos are still being built by the classical build tools, such as Gradle and SBT. I think Maven is not a popular choice for monorepos. I don't think it's able to do incremental building much at all, but I'm not super on top of those things. As to build system support in JetBrains products, so we have ongoing support for Maven, Gradle, SBT. We're trying to improve the Bazel support now. We don't have other monorepo build tools currently on our roadmap.
All right, so one last question I've seen there.
So what is the kind of tipping point when I should give up classical build tool and start using stuff like Bazel? Like the size of the project, aspects, when I should actually go to see all these pain points rather than just enjoy the build tool I know?
When you should change the build tool to Bazel? Oof, yeah. I don't have good experience points there, honestly. I just notice customers that are using and that have repositories that are like several gigabytes large, they tend to go to Bazel. We also have like repositories that are maybe in the 1 gigabyte range, and they seem to already benefit from using Bazel. If you're willing to invest in actually building a build in Bazel and with all the downsides of that. Yeah.
All right. I need to move from the speaker. So thank you for the presentation.